Back in late 2019, a developer nobody had heard of was quietly formed behind closed doors. They were handed a massive budget by their publisher and told to do two things at once: build a AAA studio from scratch and build a massive cross-platform MMO inside it. We've seen over the past couple of years how rough development has gotten stateside. Studio closures, layoffs, projects die in mid-production. Meanwhile, almost every runaway success story that I've covered on this channel has come from overseas, from studios that spent their money on pipelines and people before they shipped anything. Once Human is the perfect proof of concept for that strategy. Because they built that massive studio pipeline first, they were able to take a simple rough technical test and scale it into a free-to-play monster survival world with over 30 million players. Now, they are using that massive foundation for their next rollout to bring the complete experience natively to Xbox and PlayStation on August 25th. This is the story of how a studio was born, shipped a working MMO to over 30 million players, and slowly figured out exactly what kind of game it was making along their entire journey. Quick note up front, this video is sponsored by the teams behind Once Human, but all the research and writing is my own, meaning that everything I'm going to tell you about this game today is 100% my own thoughts, and the team at Starry Studios is seeing this video for the first time alongside you. Once Human started with a studio that didn't exist. Around 2019 into 2020, NetEase, the Chinese giant behind Marvel Rivals and the longtime operator of Blizzard's games in China, stood up a new internal team called Starry Studio. And right off the bat, the ambitions for this team were sky high. Their first assignment was to build a free-to-play, cross-platform survival game meant to go toe-to-toe with the biggest names in that genre. So, Starry built the studio first, then the game, which sounds obvious, but it's the opposite of how a lot of recent Western projects have gone. The breakthrough games of the last few years, Black Myth Wukong out of China and the Resident Evil remakes out of Japan, mostly came from teams that spent upfront on tools, tech, and headcount before a single trailer even dropped. You could see that priority most clearly in the engine. Instead of licensing Unreal or Unity and handing over a revenue cut, Starry built Once Human on Neo X, which is NetEase's in-house gaming engine, technology the company had been shipping games on for years. This meant that there were no licensing fees and they had full control of the code and an engine that already ran on phones. The last part really matters because mobile was in the plan from day one. For its first few years, the game wasn't even called Once Human. It went by the working title Project EOE, and the early test builds were rough. A character waking up with no memory in an abandoned research facility, grabbing a pistol, and fighting things crawling out of a broken world. Those builds were the testing grounds for both scaling up the team and figuring out the gameplay of Once Human. But even in that rough state, the world was already the headline. When testers and early viewers talked about the game, they weren't talking about the crafting menus, they were talking about the monsters. The sense that this wasn't just another zombie game. On June 6, 2022, NetEase dropped the codename Project EOE officially became Once Human, and 5 days later, it was revealed at IGN's Summer of Gaming, and the identity that early testers had latched onto was now front and center: cosmic horror. An alien material called Stardust had corrupted a planet, leaving behind towering monsters and ruins that reassemble themselves in daylight. You play as a metahuman, one of the rare people who can channel Stardust instead of dying from it. However, not everything with this project had landed. Players were quick to point out that some creatures, like the game's take on Siren Head, were lifted pretty directly from internet horror, and that criticism followed the game all the way to launch. The strange world was clearly the game's biggest asset. It just wasn't its own strange world yet. That tension between having a great identity and actually owning it is basically the story of everything that comes after. After the reveal, Starry ran a closed beta in September of 2022, another in November, and another in winter of 2023, plus a cloud streaming test that ran the whole game off a 25 megabyte app. Each round went in front of real players, surfaced what was broken, and fed straight into the next build. The original plan was a Steam release by the end of 2023. However, the project slipped almost a full year into July 2024. Normally, a delay that size means a project's in trouble. Here, it was just how the studio worked. Build, test, rebuild, repeat, which you can only afford to do when the team and the tools already exist. By GDC 2024, Starry's head of overseas operation, Derek Q, put the scale on the record. Over 3 years of development and over 300 people had worked on this game. The studio, the engine, and the testing culture, all of it was in place before launch day, and every single thing that happens next depended on that. Once Human launched on PC on July 9th, 2024, Steam, Epic, and NetEase's own loading bay launcher, completely free to play. And the first problem was a good one. More players showed up than the servers could handle. The game peaked above 230,000 concurrent players on Steam in its launch window and hit the platform's top 5 best sellers. Players sat in long queues for hours, and for a debut game from a studio that hadn't existed 3 years earlier, those numbers were remarkable, and they could only happen if the tech underneath can actually hold that crowd. It wasn't all smooth though. For the first few days, the Steam ratings sat at mixed. Most of the complaints had nothing to do with the gameplay. They were about the end user license agreement. It was broad, catch-all data language that read alarmingly on its own, even though it was pretty close to industry standard. Starry Studios got ahead of it fast. Within a day, community managers spelled out what was collected and what wasn't, confirming that sensitive info like ID was only used for legal age checks and deleted right after, and published a clearer policy. The harder thing to explain wasn't really a bug, it was a design choice. Once Human doesn't run on seasons the way most live games do. It runs on scenarios, themed servers with a fixed lifespan. You join one, play it for about 6 weeks, and then it ends. Your gear and resources move into a personal storage space called Eternal Land, and the world resets. What carries over is stuff you know, not stuff you have. For example, your characters, your cosmetics, blueprints, and recipes. Though the team has continued evolving the system based on player feedback over time. It's very similar to how Arc Raiders does it as well. The launch PvE scenario was Manibus, named after the enormous skyborn creature you fight at its end. The PvP side got Evolution's Call. For survival players used to tending one base for months, a 6-week wipe was a genuine hard sell. For Starry Studios, however, it was the mechanism that kept the world from getting stale. And the thing, their whole content pipeline was built to feed. Keep that in mind because it comes back in a big way. September 2024 brought a new PvP scenario, Prism vs. Clash. October added The Way of Winter, a PvE scenario set in a frozen region where the cold itself is trying to kill you. And before the year was done, Starry Studios had shipped the Visional Wheel, a new seasonal layer that stacks new mechanics on top of scenarios, plus ways to earn premium currency without grinding modes you hate. Custom servers with player set rules, and the start of a class system pushing the whole game towards RPG territory. And that's a lot of directions at once. PvP, RPG systems, seasonal layers. And in hindsight, not every one of them was where the game was heading. But if you track which updates actually stuck and which ones players still talk about, a pattern shows up fast. It's always the ones that lean into the strange world and the weird monsters that accompany it. The environments that break their own rules, and piece by piece, the game was finding its way back to the exact thing early testers loved about Project EOE. Meanwhile, the mobile version had been coming from the start. That's why Neo X mattered. By December 2024, 26 million people had pre-registered. By launch, over 30 million. Once Human hit iOS and Android globally on April 23, 2025, with full crossplay and cross progression. Same servers, same characters, and the same updates. It hit number 1 in downloads in more than 160 regions and peaked at around 1.3 million mobile players in its first month. In a single day, the audience nearly doubled, and because everyone shared one world, the launch widened the player base instead of splitting it. And then came what might be the most telling change of all. Remember that 6-week reset that players struggle with? Starry Studios had listened. In May of 2025, the team introduced permanent scenario servers, worlds that don't wipe. You could still hop into fresh scenarios for new rules and new content, or you can settle into a permanent server. Keep your base, keep your community, and explore at your own pace. The permanent servers have kept getting their own updates and optimizations since, most recently in a December dev blog laying out further improvements. That's a studio changing the fundamental structure of its live service because players had asked. The scenario model didn't go away. It's still how new content arrives, but it stopped being mandatory. The game got more flexible about how you live in its strange world without diluting what that world is. A year after launch, the game hadn't faded. Once Human was still pulling tens of thousands of concurrent Steam players every single night, peaking in the 40,000s, in a genre that usually spikes at release and craters within weeks. And version 2.0 of the game in July of 2025 is where the identity really snapped into focus. A nightmare scenario called Endless Dreams, built around abandoned amusement parks and old CRT televisions. Raid Zone, a competitive spin-off, an SCP-themed scenario, a Pal World crossover, and a chapter that switches off gravity and sends you fighting a colossal aircraft-shaped deviation across floating islands. The same showcase that announced this version 2.0 confirmed the last platform the game hadn't touched yet: consoles. The version of Once Human arriving on PlayStation and Xbox is the game at its most fully realized. Console players aren't dropping into 2024's launch build, they're walking into 2 years full of scenarios, systems, and monsters, and skipping the growing pains entirely. Showing up late to a live service game nowadays usually means you miss the best parts of it. Here, it means you start with all of it. So, what is this game now after all of that evolution? The best label I've found, and the one that the developers themselves seem to be building towards, is a strange world survival game, where every scenario is its own world with its own rules, but they all share the same core identity: surviving in places shaped by monsters, anomalies, and physics that don't stay put. The foundation is still the monster loop that Manibus teaches. Stardust has rewritten the planet. The deviations aren't just things for you to shoot, you capture them and put them to work. Some fight beside you, some gather resources, and some literally run parts of your base. But every scenario after Manibus warps those rules into a different direction. Endless Dream traps you in nightmare logic, dream zones that physically bend the space around you, dream core visuals, and progress tracked across the entire server instead of just your own camp. Raid Zone swings the other way into high pressure PvP, holding territory and fighting with mutated combat deviants. And the seasonal model the team is building towards pulls you deeper into the monster world itself, with every new update offering a completely new experience for players. None of these play like expansions, however. They play like a studio testing how far one question can stretch. What does survival look like when the world itself is an anomaly? The permanent servers fit the same pattern of loosening the rules. Scenarios are still where the new ideas show up, but nobody gets forced through the reset cycle anymore, and players who want a base that lasts can just have one. That was the single biggest complaint at launch, and 2 years later it's simply gone. And the 2 new additions push in exactly that same direction. First person mode, one of the most requested features in the game's history, arrives on PC and mobile on July 10th, and it's on consoles from day one. It's a simple change with a big effect. Exploration, shooting, and survivability all hit differently when you're at eye level with the things crawling out the world. And the console versions themselves are native PS5 and Xbox Series S and X builds running in 4K. The scale, the atmosphere, the environmental detail all land differently at this graphical fidelity. And as for what's next, The most recent updates to this game make the trajectory pretty easy to read. The focus keeps circling back to giant monsters, monster world systems, and endgame content that ties the strangeness directly into the survival loop. If you're jumping in on console, more monsters, more story, and more of that is a reasonable bet. And the business model, which is really important, hasn't changed either. It's free to play, there's no paying for power, and over 30 million players already on PC and mobile, and full cross progression. The second anniversary of Once Human hits July 10th, and Once Human officially launches on PlayStation and Xbox on August 25th. If you want to be ready, the console starter pack is up for pre-order with the link in the description, and it locks in launch rewards to jumpstart your run. And if you don't feel like waiting, the second link gets you playing free right now on Steam or mobile, with everything carrying over to console when it drops. 6 years ago, this studio didn't exist. Its first game was a strange survival idea with a great world and a lot left to figure out. What it became isn't just bigger, it's more confident about the exact thing that made it interesting in the first place. A strange world survival game where the monsters, anomalies, and scenarios are all woven into the act of surviving itself. On August 25th, that world opens up to console, and the players walking in are getting the most complete, most focused version of it that has ever existed. At the end of the day, I am so excited to see Once Human finally launch on console. It's rare to see a game that has cross progression across mobile, console, and PC all in one. Is something that I wish the entire industry would follow going forward. As always, thanks to Starry Studios for sponsoring this video, and I'll see you in the next episode.